Marcus Washington lies face down on pristine pavement in Silvercrest Park, blood trickling from his lip, surrounded by shocked onlookers, recording with phones. Officer Patrick Reynolds stands over him, smirking, unaware that the man he just assaulted is the newly appointed FBI director. Before we dive into this shocking story that exposes racial injustice at its most blatant, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their skin color, and subscribe to see more stories that shed light on the truth behind the headlines. Now, how did this morning jog turn into a national scandal? Let's find out. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Marcus Washington's newly purchased colonial-style home in Silvercrest Heights, an affluent suburb of Washington, D.C., known for its manicured lawns and influential residents. At 45 years old, Marcus had achieved what many considered the American dream, a distinguished career, a loving family, and now the prestigious position of FBI director, making him one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the United States. The grandson of sharecroppers from Mississippi, Marcus had defied expectations throughout his life, graduating from Yale Law School with honors before becoming a federal prosecutor, specializing in public corruption cases. His meteoric rise through the ranks of the Justice Department was built on a reputation for unwavering integrity and brilliant legal strategy, particularly in counterterrorism operations that had saved countless American lives. This morning was like any other in the Washington household. Marcus kissed his wife Vanessa, a pediatric surgeon, goodbye as she left for an early surgery, while their two teenagers, 16-year-old James and 14-year-old Zoe, rushed to finish breakfast before their school bus arrived. "Dad, are you still coming to my debate tournament on Friday?" Zoe asked, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "Wouldn't miss it for anything, sweetheart," Marcus replied with a warm smile that softened his otherwise serious demeanor. As the door closed behind his children, Marcus changed into his running clothes, a simple gray technical shirt and black shorts that cost more than he would have ever spent before his recent salary increase. The Washingtons had only moved to Silvercrest Heights 3 weeks ago, and Marcus was still learning the neighborhood. His security detail would begin their official protection in the evenings, but mornings were his time alone, a rare freedom he cherished. Marcus decided today he would explore Silvercrest Park, the crown jewel of the community with its winding trails and crystal-clear lake. What Marcus didn't know as he stretched on his front porch was the unspoken history of Silvercrest Heights, a community that had fought against integration for decades and where racial profiling by local police remained an open secret among residents of color. Just 3 miles away at the Silvercrest Heights Police Department, Officer Patrick Reynolds was starting his shift with his usual black coffee and complaints. At 38, Reynolds was a 12-year veteran of the force with a record that should have raised red flags. 6 complaints of excessive force, all filed by people of color, all dismissed without investigation. "These liberals are turning this town into a crime-infested dump," Reynolds muttered to his partner as they reviewed the day's patrol assignments. "Remember when you didn't see anyone who didn't belong here?" His partner nodded uncomfortably, used to Reynolds' barely veiled racism, but unwilling to challenge it. Reynolds had grown up in Silvercrest before property values skyrocketed, the son of a former officer himself, and viewed the community as something to be protected from outsiders, particularly black and brown outsiders. When the patrol assignments came through, Reynolds was pleased to see he'd drawn the park detail, a typically quiet assignment that allowed him to set his own pace. As Marcus jogged into Silvercrest Park, he breathed deeply, appreciating the perfectly maintained trails and the morning quiet. Several other joggers nodded politely as they passed, though a few did double takes. Black faces were still rare in this particular park. Reynolds spotted Marcus from his cruiser almost immediately, his attention drawn to what he later would describe as a suspicious individual who appeared out of place. Reynolds began to follow Marcus in his patrol car, keeping a distance but making his surveillance obvious. Other joggers noticed the police vehicle trailing slowly behind a black runner and exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some slowed down, sensing the potential for trouble and uncertain whether to intervene. Marcus felt the officer's eyes on his back and recognized the familiar weight of unwarranted suspicion that had followed him throughout his life, regardless of his achievements. He maintained his pace, refusing to show discomfort, though he subtly checked that his ID was secure in his zippered pocket, a habitual precaution learned through years of similar encounters. After Marcus completed his second lap around the lake, Reynolds pulled his cruiser directly into the jogging path ahead, forcing Marcus to stop. The officer emerged with his hand resting suggestively on his holster. "Good morning, officer," Marcus said calmly, already knowing where this was heading. "Can I help you with something?" Reynolds approached with unwarranted caution, as though approaching a dangerous suspect. "What are you doing in this park, buddy?" His tone made clear that Marcus was anything but his buddy. "I'm jogging," Marcus replied evenly. "I live just up on Maple Avenue." Reynolds' eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Let me see some ID. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." This was a lie. There had been no such reports. Marcus kept his expression neutral, even as familiar anger and humiliation burned in his chest. "May I ask why I'm being stopped? I'm simply exercising in a public park." The question, though politely phrased, was enough to trigger Reynolds' indignation. "Listen, I don't have to explain police procedure to you. ID now, or we're going to have a problem." The confrontation between Marcus and Officer Reynolds escalated rapidly, drawing the attention of every person within earshot. "I said show me your ID now," Reynolds demanded, his voice rising with each word. "People in this neighborhood have a right to feel safe, and you look suspicious running around here." Marcus maintained his composure, though his heart raced not from exertion, but from the familiar cocktail of anger and caution that such encounters had always evoked in him. "Officer, I recently moved to Maple Avenue with my family. I'm simply jogging in a public park, which is not illegal. I have identification, but I'd like to understand why I'm being singled out when numerous other joggers haven't been stopped." Reynolds stepped closer, deliberately invading Marcus's personal space. "Listen, smart guy, I know who belongs in this neighborhood and who doesn't. Now stop wasting my time." By now, a small crowd had begun to gather at a safe distance. Among them was Karen Mitchell, a real estate agent who lived in one of the largest homes overlooking the park. "I bet he's one of those delivery people who's been casing houses," she whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "The police know what they're doing." Another resident, George Peterson, nodded in agreement. "Can't be too careful these days. If he's not doing anything wrong, why not just comply?" Only a young woman named Alicia Rodriguez looked troubled by the scene, instinctively pulling out her phone and beginning to record. Reynolds reached for his radio, calling for backup, with an exaggerated description of the situation. "I have a possibly hostile subject at Silvercrest Park, refusing to identify himself. Approximately 6 foot 200 pounds, black male in athletic wear." The call carried an urgency that the situation didn't warrant, but Reynolds knew exactly what he was doing, escalating a simple stop into something that would justify aggressive tactics. Marcus, recognizing the dangerous trajectory of the encounter, slowly reached toward the zippered pocket of his shorts. "Officer, I'm going to get my ID for you. For you now. I'm reaching for my pocket." Reynolds instantly drew his weapon, pointing it at Marcus. "Hands where I can see them. Do not reach for anything." The gathered crowd gasped, several more phones emerging to record the incident. Marcus froze, hands raised painfully, aware that any movement could be misinterpreted with potentially fatal consequences. "I was simply reaching for my identification as you requested," he said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his body. Reynolds holstered his weapon, but then suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the shoulder and spinning him around. With unnecessary force, he slammed Marcus face first onto the pavement, driving his knee into the small of Marcus's back as he pinned him down. The impact split Marcus's lip against the concrete, blood spattering on the pristine walkway. The $300 running shirt tore at the shoulder, and Marcus felt the skin of his cheek scraping against the rough surface. "Stop resisting!" Reynolds shouted, though Marcus had offered no resistance whatsoever. "I'm not resisting," Marcus managed to say through gritted teeth, the weight on his back making it difficult to breathe. Reynolds roughly yanked Marcus's arms behind his back, tightening handcuffs around his wrists with unnecessary force. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you." Reynolds muttered loud enough for Marcus to hear, but not quite loud enough for the gathering crowd. By now, nearly a dozen onlookers had formed a semicircle around the scene, most recording with their phones. Among them was 16-year-old Tyler Johnson, who nudged his friend with sudden recognition. "Dude, I think that's the new FBI guy. I just saw him on the news last week." But fear kept Tyler silent. Who would believe a teenager over a police officer? With Marcus securely handcuffed and bleeding on the ground, Reynolds began to search his pockets roughly. "Let's see who you really are, tough guy. Probably don't even live around here like you claim." Marcus, despite the humiliation and physical pain, maintained his dignity. "Officer, I am the newly appointed director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My credentials are in my right pocket." Reynolds laughed derisively, looking back at the crowd as if sharing a joke. "Yeah, and I'm the President of the United States. We get all kinds of crazy stories." He pulled out Marcus's wallet and running keys, tossing them on the ground next to him. Several in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, beginning to sense that something was very wrong with this situation. Alicia Rodriguez stepped closer, her phone still recording. "Is this really necessary, officer? He doesn't appear to be resisting at all." Reynolds turned toward her with a threatening glare. "Ma'am, step back and let law enforcement do its job unless you want to be obstructing justice." Marcus remained face down on the pavement, blood pooling beneath his cheek as Reynolds continued his search. The officer's hand finally located the zippered pocket and extracted a small leather folder. When he flipped it open, the federal badge and identification card of FBI Director Marcus Washington stared back at him. For a brief moment, Reynolds froze his face, a mask of disbelief, but rather than immediately releasing Marcus, he doubled down. "This looks fake. Impersonating a federal officer is a serious offense. Now you're in real trouble." Officer Reynolds stood over Marcus, still holding the FBI credentials, with visible contempt, unwilling to accept the reality that was literally in his hands. "Who did you steal these from?" he demanded, his voice carrying a slight tremor that betrayed his growing uncertainty. The plastic-encased identification card clearly displayed Marcus's photograph alongside the FBI seal and his title as director, but Reynolds's mind was working overtime to create an alternative explanation. Any explanation that wouldn't mean he had just assaulted one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. The crowd had grown to nearly 20 people, now all witnessing what was quickly becoming a career-ending mistake. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the morning air as a second police cruiser pulled into the park entrance. Officer Sarah Chen, a 5-year veteran of the Silvercrest Heights Police Department, exited her vehicle and approached the scene with measured steps, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to visible concern as she recognized the man on the ground. Chen had attended a multi-agency terrorism response training just 3 months earlier, where Marcus, then deputy director, had been the keynote speaker. "Officer Reynolds," she said quietly but firmly as she reached the scene, "I need to speak with you immediately." Reynolds glared at her, irritated by the interruption. "I'm handling a situation here. This suspect is in possession of what appears to be fraudulent federal identification." Chen's eyes widened momentarily before she regained her composure. "A word, please, now." She practically pulled Reynolds several feet away, keeping her voice low but intense. "That's Marcus Washington. He's the actual FBI director. I've met him personally at a joint training. You need to release him immediately." Reynolds's face flushed red, a mixture of embarrassment and stubborn disbelief. "That's impossible. What would the FBI director be doing jogging alone in our park? This has to be some kind of scam." Chen pulled out her phone, quickly typing something before showing Reynolds the screen. A news article from the previous month about Marcus Washington's historic appointment as the first black FBI director, complete with a photograph that was unmistakably the man currently handcuffed and bleeding on the ground. "This is real, Patrick. We need to fix this right now." While the officers conferred, Marcus remained on the ground, maintaining a dignified silence despite the physical discomfort and public humiliation. He had faced racism throughout his distinguished career, from being mistaken for a janitor during his early days as a federal prosecutor to being asked for ID when entering secure federal buildings, while his white colleagues walked by unchallenged. But never had the indignity been so public or physically aggressive. Reynolds reluctantly followed Chen back to where Marcus lay. "I need to verify this identification," he insisted, still unwilling to admit his error. Chen stepped in, bending down beside Marcus. "Sir, I apologize for this situation. Let me help you up while we sort this out." Before she could assist, a black SUV with government plates screeched to a halt at the park entrance. And Captain Gerald Wilson of the Silvercrest Heights Police Department emerged, almost running toward the scene. A park visitor had recognized Marcus and called the police station, directly bypassing dispatch. Captain Wilson, a 25-year veteran, weeks away from retirement, immediately recognized the magnitude of the disaster unfolding in his jurisdiction. "Release him immediately," Wilson barked at Reynolds, who finally unlocked the handcuffs with trembling hands. Chen and Wilson carefully helped Marcus to his feet, his torn clothing and bloodied face creating a stark image against the manicured park setting. Marcus straightened himself, brushing dirt from his clothes with as much dignity as possible, acutely aware of the phone still recording every moment. Captain Wilson was ashen-faced. "Director Washington, I cannot begin to express my apologies for this inexcusable incident. We will ensure this is addressed appropriately." Reynolds, now fully understanding his situation, began a stream of excuses. "Sir, I was following department protocols for suspicious persons. The subject didn't immediately identify himself." Wilson cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Not another word, Reynolds. Return to your vehicle and wait for me there." As Reynolds retreated, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, the story spreading rapidly through whispers and text messages. "That's the FBI director. Did you see how that cop treated him? This is going to be national news by lunch." Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying authority that silenced everyone within earshot. "Captain Wilson, I'll need your officer's full name and badge number, and I believe the body camera footage will be of particular interest to the review that will commence regarding police procedures in this district." His words carried no hint of personal vindictiveness, but rather the clear intention of a professional committed to accountability. The crowd had nearly doubled in size, with park-goers abandoning their morning routines to witness the unfolding drama. Officer Chen handed Marcus a clean handkerchief for his bleeding lip, her expression a mixture of professional concern and personal mortification. "Sir, would you like medical attention? We can have paramedics here in minutes." Marcus declined with a slight shake of his head. "That won't be necessary, Officer Chen. Thank you." The way he addressed her by name, having read her badge while still handcuffed on the ground, sent a clear message to everyone present. He missed nothing, remembered everything. Captain Wilson dismissed the growing crowd, attempting damage control, even as he knew this incident could not be contained. "Would you have stood up against this injustice if you had been in the park that morning?" Comment number 1. If you believe witnesses should intervene when they see discrimination happening. Or number 2. If you think it's too risky to get involved. Hit that like button. if you're appalled by what happened to Marcus and subscribe to follow his journey toward justice. The question remains, how will Marcus respond to this humiliation? Will he seek personal revenge against Officer Reynolds, or does he have a larger goal in mind? The answer might surprise you. The crowd eventually dispersed under Captain Wilson's direction, though not before dozens of videos of the incident had been captured, and several had already been uploaded to social media. Marcus Washington stood in the middle of Silvercrest Park, physically diminished by his torn clothing and bloodied face, but somehow more imposing in his calm dignity than any shouting or threats could have made him. Despite repeated offers of medical attention, Marcus refused, understanding intuitively that images of him being loaded into an ambulance would only compound the public relations disaster for both himself and the FBI. "I appreciate your concern, Captain Wilson, but I'll have my personal physician examine me later," Marcus said, using his running shirt to dab at his still bleeding lip. "What I will need from you is confirmation that Officer Reynolds' body camera was functioning throughout our encounter." Captain Wilson nodded grimly, shooting a warning glance at Reynolds, who remained by his patrol car, alternating between pale shock and flushed embarrassment. "It was Operational Director Washington. I'll personally ensure all footage is preserved." The captain's phone buzzed incessantly as calls poured in from the mayor's office, county officials, and increasingly national media outlets. The black government SUV that had brought Captain Wilson to the scene now idled nearby its driver, standing at attention, waiting to transport Marcus wherever he needed to go. Before Marcus could decide his next move, another vehicle pulled up, a sleek silver Audi with federal government plates. Assistant Director Eliza Harmon emerged, her typically immaculate appearance slightly disheveled in her haste to reach the scene after receiving an urgent call from the FBI's Public Affairs Office. Eliza, a 20-year veteran of the Bureau and one of Marcus's most trusted advisors, took in the scene with a quick assessing glance. Her boss's bloodied face, the police captain's barely contained panic, and the officer who had created this disaster still hovering by his patrol car. "Marcus," she said, dispensing with formalities in her concern. "Are you all right?" Her eyes narrowed at his injuries, a flash of anger crossing her features before her professional mask returned. "I'm fine, Eliza," Marcus replied, though the cut on his lip and the abrasion on his cheek suggested otherwise. He turned to Captain Wilson. "Captain, I believe we've concluded our business here for now. Your officer's badge number and incident report should be forwarded to Assistant Director Harmon by end of day." Wilson nodded vigorously. "Of course, Director. Again, I want to express my deepest—" Marcus raised a hand, stopping the apology mid-sentence. "Actions, Captain, not words." With that, he walked toward Eliza's car, declining her offer to drive him to the emergency room. Once inside the vehicle, with the doors closed, the careful composure Marcus had maintained in public fractured slightly. He leaned back against the headrest, closing his eyes momentarily as the adrenaline began to ebb, leaving behind the throbbing pain of his injuries. "This is going to be a circus," Eliza said, not starting the car immediately. "Social media is already exploding. 3 different videos of the incident are trending." Marcus nodded, having expected nothing less. "We need to get ahead of it. No statements until I've had time to think, but have communications monitoring the situation." Eliza hesitated, then voiced what many at the Bureau would soon be thinking. "Marcus, we could handle this quietly. A private reprimand for the officer, maybe some sensitivity training for the department. It doesn't have to become a public spectacle that distracts from our actual work." Marcus turned to look at her directly, his expression hardening. "That approach is precisely why incidents like this continue to happen, Eliza. How many other black men has Officer Reynolds accosted who didn't happen to be the FBI director, who didn't have the power to demand accountability? This isn't a distraction from our work. This is our work. Ensuring justice applies equally to everyone." Eliza didn't argue further, recognizing the resolve in her boss's voice. As they drove toward Marcus's home, Officer Reynolds was being escorted back to the Silvercrest Heights Police Department, his patrol duties suspended immediately. Captain Wilson had confiscated his weapon and badge, pending an investigation, a process usually reserved for officers who had discharged their weapons in the line of duty. Reynolds sat in a conference room, the gravity of his situation slowly sinking in as department lawyers were frantically called in. "I was just following protocol," he repeated to anyone who would listen. "How was I supposed to know who he was?" No one bothered to point out the obvious, that his treatment would have been unjustified regardless of who Marcus Washington was. Marcus arrived home to find his son James already there, having received a text from a friend about the incident. School suddenly seemed unimportant compared to what had happened to his father. "Dad, oh!" James exclaimed, rushing to the door when he heard the car pull up. The teenager stopped short at the sight of his father's injuries, his expression morphing from concern to fury. "Who did this to you?" Vanessa Washington had also returned home after being notified by Marcus's security detail, who had been alerted to the incident by the local police. As a surgeon, her first instinct was to examine her husband's wounds, her gentle fingers probing the cut on his lip and the abrasion on his cheekbone. "You need stitches for this lip, Marcus," she said, her professional tone belied by the tears in her eyes, "and this needs to be cleaned properly to prevent infection." Marcus submitted to her examination, knowing from 15 years of marriage that arguing would be pointless. Zoe arrived home minutes later, having also received texts from classmates. Unlike her brother's anger, her reaction was one of fear. "Are you going to be okay, Dad?" she asked in a small voice that reminded Marcus painfully of when she was much younger. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he assured her, though the sight of her father's bloodied face had clearly shaken her. As Vanessa tended to his wounds with her well-stocked medical kit, James paced the living room, his phone buzzing constantly with notifications. "It's everywhere, Dad. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Everyone's talking about it. Some of the videos have hundreds of thousands of views already." Marcus nodded unsurprised. "James, I need you to understand something important. Don't respond to any of these posts. Don't make statements online. This situation will be handled through proper channels." James stopped pacing, frustration clear on his face. "But people need to see what happened. That cop should be fired. Everyone needs to know." "James," Marcus interrupted firmly, "we will address this, but we'll do it the right way." Vanessa, finishing with the butterfly bandage on Marcus's lip, finally voiced what had been bothering her since they moved. "I was worried about this neighborhood, Marcus. The realtor was so careful with her wording, talking about how exclusive and traditional the community was. Code words I've heard my entire life." Marcus took her hand, acknowledging her concerns. "You were right to be concerned, but running from these situations doesn't fix them." His phone rang, the first of what would be countless calls that day. This one was from the Attorney General herself, who had been briefed on the situation. After a brief conversation assuring her he was physically fine, Marcus ended the call and turned to his family. "I need to get cleaned up and go to the office. This is going to require careful handling." Vanessa nodded, understanding, as always, the demands of his position, though concern still creased her brow. "Just promise me you won't let them sweep this under the rug. Not this time." Marcus kissed her, gently mindful of his injured lip. "Never," he promised. As Marcus showered and changed into a suit, the professional armor he'd wear to face the coming storm news of the incident continued to spread through law enforcement channels. At the FBI headquarters, agents and staff watched the viral videos with stunned expressions, seeing their normally composed director handcuffed face down on pavement. At the Silvercrest Heights Police Department, officers were divided, some horrified by Reynolds' actions and the department's impending public relations nightmare, others quietly sympathetic to their colleague, believing he had simply been doing his job. Social media exploded with hashtags #jogging. While black, Silvercrest, racism and director on the ground. Commentators from across the political spectrum weighed in, some condemning the obvious racial profiling, others questioning why Marcus hadn't immediately identified himself as FBI director, ignoring, of course, that he had tried to reach for his identification when Reynolds interpreted the movement as a threat. By afternoon, the incident had transcended local news to become a national conversation about race law enforcement and the persistence of bias even against the most accomplished Black Americans. And Marcus Washington, cleaning the dried blood from his face as he prepared to address the situation, had already made his decision. This would not be handled quietly. This would not be another incident buried under bureaucracy and platitudes about unfortunate misunderstandings. This time, there would be accountability. 2 days after the incident at Silvercrest Park, Marcus Washington strode through the marble lobby of the FBI headquarters, nodding to the security officers who snapped to attention at his passage. Despite his best efforts to project normalcy, the visible bruising on his face told its own story. Agents and administrative staff tried not to stare, but whispers followed in his wake as he made his way to the executive floor. His assistant, Robert Keller, rose from his desk as Marcus approached. "Good morning, Director. Your 9 o'clock briefing is ready in the conference room, and Deputy Director Blackwell asked to see you before that if possible." Marcus nodded, noting the careful way Robert avoided mentioning his injuries. "Tell Thomas I'll see him in my office in 5 minutes." Once behind the closed door of his office, Marcus allowed himself a moment to feel the throbbing pain in his cheek and the stiffness in his back from being forced to the ground. The Bureau's chief medical officer had examined him yesterday, documenting his injuries for what would inevitably become part of an official investigation. The bruising looked worse today, yellowing around the edges while the center remained a deep purple, making it impossible for anyone who saw him to forget what had happened. A soft knock preceded Deputy Director Thomas Blackwell's entrance. At 62, Blackwell was a Bureau veteran with silver hair and the polished manner of someone who had navigated Washington politics for decades. His expression revealed genuine concern as he took in Marcus's appearance. "Marcus, how are you feeling?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "I've been better," Marcus replied honestly, gesturing for Blackwell to take a seat. "But I'm more concerned about the fallout. Where do we stand?" Blackwell settled into the chair across from Marcus's desk, his expression shifting to one of careful neutrality. "The videos have gone viral as expected. Every major news network has covered it. The President called twice yesterday for updates. The Attorney General is fielding questions about whether we'll be opening a pattern or practice investigation into Silvercrest Heights PD." He paused, choosing his next words deliberately. "Marcus, there's a way to handle this that minimizes disruption to our operations. A quiet but firm response, appropriate disciplinary action for the officer, perhaps some required departmental training. We could issue a joint statement with Silvercrest Heights PD and put this behind us." Marcus studied his deputy, a man he respected for his institutional knowledge even when they disagreed on approach. "That's not going to happen, Thomas. I've already directed the Civil Rights Division to begin a formal investigation into the department's practices. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a systemic problem." Blackwell leaned forward, his voice lowered, though they were alone in the office. "Marcus, I understand your personal stake in this, but this isn't personal." Marcus interrupted his tone, firm but controlled. "This is precisely what this Bureau exists to address. Equal application of the law, protection of civil rights accountability for those who abuse their authority." His gaze was steady as he continued. "If I were just another black man in that park, a teacher, an accountant, a construction worker, would there be national news coverage? Would the officer face any consequences at all? Or would it be dismissed as following protocol, while another citizen carries the psychological and sometimes physical scars of being treated as inherently suspicious?" Blackwell had no answer to these questions, and both men knew it. "The investigation proceeds as directed," Marcus concluded, effectively ending the discussion. Now, let's get to that 9 o'clock briefing. The resistance Marcus encountered wasn't limited to his own agency. That afternoon, his secure line rang with a call from the Silvercrest Heights Police Union President, Michael Donahue. "Director Washington, thank you for taking my call." Donahue began his tone professionally cordial, but with an underlying tension. "I wanted to discuss the situation with Officer Reynolds directly." Marcus kept his own voice neutral. "I'm listening, Mr. Donahue. We understand the unfortunate nature of Monday's incident, but we believe Officer Reynolds was following established departmental procedures for suspicious persons in the area. There have been recent reports of property crimes, and officers are instructed to be vigilant." The implication that Marcus had somehow appeared suspicious simply by jogging while black hung in the air unacknowledged but unmistakable. "Mr. Donahue," Marcus replied evenly, "I was unarmed and running clothes in a public park, engaged in the same activity as a dozen other individuals who weren't stopped." Officer Reynolds escalated a simple identification check into a physical confrontation within minutes, resulting in injuries and a clear violation of my civil rights. Donahue cleared his throat. "Director, with all due respect, when an officer requests identification, immediate compliance is expected from all citizens. Any hesitation can be interpreted as potential resistance." Marcus's patience thinned at the familiar refrain, the circular logic that placed the burden of perfect compliance on citizens rather than reasonable restraint on officers. "The body camera footage shows I was reaching for my identification when Officer Reynolds interpreted that movement as a threat. This appears to be a pattern with Officer Reynolds, which the investigation will examine." There was a brief silence before Donahue shifted tactics. "We've released a statement supporting Officer Reynolds and noting his exemplary 7 years of service to the community. We believe this single incident should not define his career, and we're prepared to vigorously defend his actions as consistent with training and protocol." Marcus wasn't surprised by the union's stance. It was their job to defend officers regardless of conduct. But the description of Reynolds's exemplary service caught his attention. His own preliminary research had revealed multiple complaints buried in administrative files. "Mr. Donahue, I appreciate your position, but I suggest you review Officer Reynolds's complete record before making further public statements. The investigation will be thorough and fair." After ending the call, Marcus asked his assistant to connect him with the FBI's Records Division. His instincts told him there was more to Reynolds's history than a few dismissed complaints, and he intended to find out what it was. By evening, Marcus's suspicions were confirmed when a thick file landed on his desk. Reynolds had accumulated 8 formal complaints of excessive force or racial profiling over 7 years, all involving people of color, all mysteriously resolved with no disciplinary action. More disturbing was the pattern of similar complaints against 5 other officers in the same department, suggesting a culture that tolerated or even encouraged discriminatory policing. As Marcus reviewed the documents, Captain Wilson requested a private meeting at a neutral location away from both the FBI and the police department. They met at a small coffee shop halfway between Washington, D.C. and Silvercrest Heights. Wilson, looking considerably older than he had just days ago, sat across from Marcus with a cup of coffee, cooling untouched before him. "I appreciate you meeting me, Director Washington," he began, his voice low to avoid being overheard. "There are things about the department you should know, things I've tried to address, but faced resistance at every turn." Marcus listened as Wilson described his failed attempts to discipline officers like Reynolds, only to be blocked by union procedures, political interference, and a department culture resistant to change. "I've got 6 months until retirement," Wilson confessed. "I've been trying to write it out, make small changes where I could. But after what happened to you, I can't stay silent anymore." Marcus studied the captain thoughtfully. "Why come forward now, Captain Wilson? These problems didn't begin this week." Wilson met his gaze directly. "Because for once, the victim is someone they can't ignore or intimidate. Someone with the power to actually make changes stick. That evening, as Marcus briefed his wife on the day's developments, another confrontation was brewing. The mayor of Silvercrest Heights, Eleanor Griffith, had requested an off-the-record conversation with Marcus to resolve the situation amicably. Marcus declined the private meeting, insisting that any discussions about the investigation remain official and documented. The mayor's office then released a carefully worded statement expressing regret for the unfortunate misunderstanding, while emphasizing the city's commitment to supporting our dedicated police officers who keep our community safe. The statement made no mention of racial profiling or excessive force, focusing instead on improving communication between officers and the public. Marcus read the statement with a grim lack of surprise. This was how these incidents were typically handled: vague statements, promises of review that led nowhere, and a rapid pivot to moving on without addressing root causes. His phone rang again, this time the Silvercrest Heights District Attorney, Anthony Parker. Director Washington, I wanted to personally assure you that my office is reviewing the incident for potential charges against Officer Reynolds. We take these matters very seriously. Marcus noted that this call came only after the videos had gone viral and the FBI investigation had been announced. I appreciate that, Mr. Parker. I'd be interested to know how many excessive force complaints your office has reviewed from Silvercrest Heights PD in the past 5 years, and how many resulted in charges. The uncomfortable silence on the line was answer enough. I'll have my office compile those statistics, Parker finally replied. But I want to assure you this case will receive our full attention. After hanging up, Marcus stared out his office window at the Washington Monument illuminated against the night sky. The machinery of damage control was in full motion, statements crafted by PR teams, careful phone calls, political calculations. But beneath it all, the same resistance to meaningful change remained entrenched. His secure phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Not all of us are like Reynolds. Some of us want change too. Check your private email. Hours later, after returning home to his family, Marcus found the promised email, sent anonymously, but containing internal Silvercrest Heights PD documents showing a clear pattern of racial profiling in traffic stops and park patrols, with statistics carefully manipulated in public reports to obscure the disparity. Someone on the inside was taking an enormous professional risk to share this information. As Marcus prepared for bed that night, wincing slightly as he removed his shirt over his still tender back, he knew the battle ahead would be neither quick nor easy. The resistance wasn't just from Officer Reynolds or even the police union. It was baked into systems designed to protect themselves at all costs, to resist scrutiny, to maintain the status quo even when that status quo caused clear harm. But now those systems faced something they rarely encountered: a victim they couldn't silence with the power and determination to demand real accountability. And Marcus Washington had no intention of backing down. The unmarked envelope arrived at the Washington home on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the incident at Silvercrest Park. No return address, no postmark. It had been hand-delivered sometime in the night. Vanessa found it while retrieving the morning newspaper, the plain white envelope stark against the welcome mat. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message assembled from cut-out magazine letters, like a ransom note from an old movie: "Go back where you came from, or next time will be worse." Vanessa's hand trembled slightly as she held the paper, the crude threat awakening primal fears for her family's safety. She considered hiding it from Marcus, already overwhelmed with the investigation and media scrutiny, but their marriage had survived 20 years on a foundation of honesty. She placed the note on the kitchen counter where he would see it during breakfast. Marcus stared at the note, his expression unreadable as he absorbed this new development. "I'll have it analyzed for fingerprints," he said, finally slipping the note and envelope into a plastic bag. "And I'll arrange for additional security for the house." Vanessa watched him, recognizing the careful control he maintained over his emotions. A necessary skill in his position, but sometimes a barrier between them. "Marcus," she said softly, placing her hand over his. "Talk to me. How are you really doing with all of this?" For a moment, the FBI director's professional mask slipped, revealing the husband and father beneath. "I'm angry, Van. Not just about what happened to me, but that this is still happening at all. That our children have to grow up in a world where this is still their reality, regardless of what we achieve." He gestured to the threat letter. "That people still think they can intimidate us into silence or compliance." Vanessa squeezed his hand. "We knew this neighborhood might be challenging, but we agreed we wouldn't raise our children to run from difficult situations." Marcus nodded, drawing strength from her resolute support, as he had countless times throughout their relationship. "No running," he agreed, "but I am worried about you and the kids. These threats can't be taken lightly." That afternoon, while Marcus was meeting with the Civil Rights Division team leading the Silvercrest investigation, James Washington was defending his father's honor in a more direct way. It began in the cafeteria at Silvercrest Heights Academy, where James had overheard a classmate, Tyler Reynolds, Officer Reynolds' son, loudly proclaiming that Marcus had played the race card and was trying to ruin my dad's career for political points. James had initially walked away, remembering his father's advice to choose his battles wisely. But when Tyler added, "Your dad probably mouthed off and got what was coming to him," something snapped. The ensuing fight was brief but explosive. Both boys were sent to the principal's office with bloodied noses and bruised knuckles, their parents summoned immediately. Marcus arrived to find James sitting stoically outside the principal's office, an ice pack pressed to his swollen right hand. Across the room, Patrick Reynolds glared daggers at them both, his son sulking beside him with tissue stuffed up his nostrils to stop the bleeding. "He shouldn't have said those things about you, Dad," James muttered as Marcus sat beside him. "I know you told me to ignore stuff like that, but—" Marcus sighed, caught between parental disapproval of violence and understanding of his son's impulse to defend him. "We'll talk about this at home," he said, keeping his voice low as the principal opened her door to invite them in. The meeting was tense and uncomfortable, with Reynolds refusing to make eye contact with Marcus while simultaneously demanding James be suspended for attacking his son. Principal Gardner, clearly intimidated by having the FBI director and a police officer in her office, at the same time attempted to mediate fairly, but kept shooting nervous glances at Marcus. "Both boys were fighting Officer Reynolds," she said firmly. "According to witnesses, your son made provocative statements first, but James escalated to physical confrontation. Neither behavior is acceptable at this school." In the end, both boys received 3-day suspensions, and Marcus found himself driving home with a silent, angry teenager beside him. "I'm not sorry," James said finally as they pulled into their driveway. "He deserved it." Marcus turned off the engine but didn't immediately get out of the car. "James, I understand why you did it, but you can't solve problems this way. Violence just creates more violence." James stared out the window, his jaw set stubbornly. "So we just let people say whatever they want about us, do whatever they want to us, turn the other cheek while they beat us down." The echo of Marcus's own anger in his son's words was jarring. "No," Marcus replied carefully. "We fight back, but intelligently, systematically, through channels that create lasting change. Your fist in Tyler's face might feel satisfying in the moment, but it changes nothing in the long run. It just reinforces their narrative about us." Meanwhile, across town, Patrick Reynolds sat in his darkened living room, a half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels on the coffee table before him. His wife, Karen, had taken their son to her mother's house after another explosive argument about the park incident. "You've destroyed everything," she had screamed before slamming the door. "Your career, our reputation, our son's friendships, all because you couldn't see past the color of someone's skin." Reynolds poured another drink with an unsteady hand, bitterness and fear warring within him. He'd been placed on administrative leave without pay, pending the investigation. His fellow officers suddenly distant his phone, filled with messages from reporters seeking comment. His life was unraveling, and in his mind it was all Marcus Washington's fault, not his own actions, not his own prejudices, but the black man who had dared to question his authority. The bottle was nearly empty when his phone rang. Michael Donahue from the police union. "Patrick, we need to talk strategy," Donahue said without preamble. "The FBI's digging into every complaint ever filed against you. They're pulling records on traffic stops and arrest patterns, everything. We need to get out ahead of this." Reynolds laughed bitterly. "Ahead of it? It's too late for that, Michael. Washington's going to bury me, make an example out of me." "Not if we discredit him first," Donahue replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "We've been looking into his background. Everyone has skeletons, Patrick. We just need to find his." Back at FBI headquarters, Marcus was dealing with his own internal challenges. Several senior agents had expressed concerns about the investigation, distracting from core bureau priorities, and potentially damaging relationships with local law enforcement agencies. "We depend on cooperation from departments like Silvercrest Heights for joint operations," argued Assistant Director William Hayes in a closed-door meeting. This very public investigation could chill those relationships nationwide. Marcus listened to these concerns with outward patience, though inwardly his frustration mounted. "Would you suggest we ignore civil rights violations because addressing them might be uncomfortable for our working relationships?" he asked finally. "The foundation of those relationships must be mutual respect for the law and equal justice. Anything less undermines our core mission." Not everyone at the Bureau shared Hayes's concerns. Many agents, particularly those of color, had expressed private support for Marcus's stance, sharing their own experiences with racial profiling. Officer Sarah Chen had become an unexpected ally, risking her standing in her department by providing additional documentation of problematic patterns in Silvercrest Heights policing. "They're watching me like a hawk now," she confided during a secure call with Marcus's investigative team. "But someone has to speak up. What happened to you could have happened to any person of color in our jurisdiction, and has repeatedly." That evening, Marcus returned home later than usual, mentally exhausted from navigating both the investigation and the political maneuvering around it. He found Vanessa sitting at the kitchen table with a troubled expression, a letter from their homeowners association before her. "They're claiming our security upgrades violate neighborhood aesthetic guidelines," she explained, pushing the letter toward him. "Apparently, visible security cameras detract from the historical character of the neighborhood. They're threatening fines if we don't remove them within 7 days." Marcus scanned the letter, noting that it had been signed by Karen Mitchell, the same woman who had whispered about him casing houses during his confrontation with Reynolds. "This is harassment," he said, setting the letter aside. "Our security consultant can confirm these measures are necessary due to documented threats. They won't be removed." Vanessa studied her husband's face, noting the new lines of strain around his eyes. "Is it worth it, Marcus? All of this? The threats, the stress on the kids, the political battles? Is it worth what it's costing us?" Marcus was silent for a long moment, considering her question seriously. "If we back down, if we let them push us out or intimidate us into silence, what message does that send to James and Zoe? What message does it send to every other person who faces this kind of discrimination without having the FBI director's resources and platform?" He reached across the table to take her hand. "I believe it's worth it, but this has to be a family decision. If you and the kids feel unsafe, if this is too much to ask of you." Vanessa squeezed his hand. "Her decision already made. We're with you all the way. But promise me you'll remember what you're fighting for, not just abstract principles of justice, but a future where our children don't have to face what you faced in that park." That night, as Marcus lay awake beside his sleeping wife, doubts crept in despite his conviction. Was he putting his family at risk for a principle? Was his position as FBI director creating expectations he couldn't fulfill? Would anything really change, or was he tilting at windmills while endangering what mattered most? Do you think Marcus should continue his fight for justice, despite the personal costs to his family? Comment number 1. If you believe standing up against systemic racism is worth the sacrifices. Or, number 2, if you think he should prioritize his family's safety and peace of mind. Hit that like button if you admire Marcus's courage in challenging a corrupt system, and subscribe to see how this confrontation escalates. The question hangs in the balance: will Marcus find a way to create meaningful change, or will the system's resistance prove too powerful even for the FBI director? As dawn approached with no answers, Marcus finally drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware that across town, the police union was implementing their plan to undermine him, a plan that would target not just his professional reputation, but the safety and stability of his family. 3 weeks after the Silvercrest Park incident, the FBI's preliminary investigation had uncovered disturbing patterns within the Silvercrest Heights Police Department. The confidential report, compiled by a team of civil rights investigators working directly under Marcus's authority, documented racial disparities in traffic stops, use of force incidents, and complaint dismissals that far exceeded national averages. African Americans, who comprised only 8% of Silvercrest Heights' population, accounted for 62% of physical force incidents and 71% of complaints filed against officers. Most damning was the department's internal response to these complaints. 97% were dismissed without formal investigation, often with nearly identical language citing officer discretion and compliance with departmental procedures. Marcus reviewed the report in his secure office, each statistic confirming what he had personally experienced, but now quantified in stark, undeniable data. The investigation had expanded beyond Officer Reynolds to reveal what appeared to be a culture of discrimination protected by institutional barriers to accountability. We have enough here to justify a comprehensive pattern or practice investigation, noted Civil Rights Division Attorney Julia Martinez, who had presented the findings, and potentially federal oversight of the department if these patterns are confirmed through the full investigation. Marcus nodded, authorizing the escalation to a full departmental investigation, a serious step that would place Silvercrest Heights Police under intense federal scrutiny. What neither Marcus nor his team knew was that someone had leaked news of the preliminary findings to a source at the Silvercrest Heights Police Department. The leak came not from ill intent, but from an FBI administrative assistant who had mentioned the investigation's progress to her brother-in-law, a firefighter who shared a regular poker game with several Silvercrest officers. Within hours, the police union leadership had been alerted that a major federal action was imminent. Their response was swift and aggressive. Anonymous sources familiar with FBI operations have revealed concerns about Director Washington's potential misuse of Bureau resources for personal vendettas. Read the statement released by the Fraternal Order of Police to selected media outlets. Questions have been raised about whether Director Washington's pursuit of Silvercrest Heights PD stems from professional judgment or personal animus after a routine law enforcement encounter. The statement carefully avoided direct accusations while planting seeds of doubt about Marcus's motivations and judgment. Simultaneously, Officer Reynolds' personnel file was leaked to sympathetic journalists, a selectively edited version that omitted the numerous complaints against him while highlighting commendations and positive performance reviews. The narrative being constructed portrayed Reynolds as an exemplary officer being sacrificed to political correctness, and Marcus as an overly sensitive bureaucrat abusing federal power for personal revenge. Marcus had anticipated resistance but was still surprised by the coordinated nature of the counterattack. "They're trying to make this about me rather than about systemic issues," he observed to Assistant Director Harmon during their morning briefing. "Classic deflection strategy." Eliza nodded grimly. "It gets worse. They're suggesting you were actually in a restricted area of the park that morning, a section closed for maintenance. They've produced work orders showing scheduled landscaping in the northeast quadrant where Reynolds first approached you. Marcus's eyes narrowed. That's a fabrication. I was on the main jogging path the entire time. We know that, yes, Eliza confirmed. The body camera footage clearly shows your location, but they're trying to create an alternative narrative to justify Reynolds's initial stop. Before Marcus could respond, his secure line rang, an encrypted channel used only for urgent bureau matters. The caller was Technical Director Jordan Freeman from the FBI's Digital Evidence Laboratory. Director Washington, we've completed our analysis of Officer Reynolds's body camera footage, Freeman reported. We've identified several anomalies that suggest the version provided to us by Silvercrest Heights PD may have been altered. Marcus straightened in his chair, immediately alert. Altered how? Selective editing to remove approximately 27 seconds from the initial encounter. We compared it with civilian phone footage from the scene and identified the discrepancy. The missing section appears to contain Reynolds making statements not reflected in the official transcript. Within hours, Marcus had authorized a formal subpoena for the original unaltered body camera footage, an escalation that sent shockwaves through the Silvercrest Heights Police Department. Captain Wilson, caught between loyalty to his department and his growing disgust with the cover-up attempts, made a momentous decision. He requested a private meeting with the FBI investigative team, bringing with him a thumb drive containing not just the original footage from Reynolds's confrontation with Marcus, but dozens of other incidents involving the same group of officers who had repeatedly targeted people of color in Silvercrest Heights. I can't be part of this anymore, Wilson told the investigators, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. I've tried to change things from within for years. It hasn't worked. Maybe this will. The unaltered footage revealed what Reynolds and the department had attempted to hide. Explicit racial language during the initial approach to Marcus, including Reynolds telling his partner via radio, "Got another one who doesn't belong here, probably casing houses." More damning was Reynolds's response when Marcus politely asked why he was being stopped. People like you need to learn respect for authority. The footage directly contradicted Reynolds's written statement, claiming he had approached Marcus due to suspicious behavior consistent with burglary patterns in the area. As the FBI investigation intensified, so did the pressure on Marcus's family. Zoe returned from school in tears after classmates showed her social media posts mocking her father. James, still on suspension after the fight with Tyler Reynolds, had withdrawn into angry silence, spending hours alone in his room. Vanessa had received anonymous calls at the hospital where she worked, some simply hanging up when she answered, others breathing heavily before disconnecting. The psychological toll was mounting, but the Washingtons refused to be intimidated into silence. The confrontation reached a new level when local news reported that the police union had hired a private investigator to look into Marcus's background, seeking any information that might discredit him. "This is beyond unprofessional," Marcus's attorney stated publicly. "It represents a desperate attempt to distract from serious civil rights violations by attacking the victim." Public opinion began to shift as more residents of Silvercrest Heights came forward with their own stories of discriminatory treatment by police. A community forum organized by local civil rights activists drew hundreds of attendees, including many white residents shocked by the emerging pattern of abuses in their community. "I always trusted our police," admitted elderly resident Margaret Phillips during the forum. "But after seeing what happened to Director Washington and now hearing these other stories, I have to question that trust." Meanwhile, Reynolds was growing increasingly isolated as the fabrications unraveled. His union representatives became more distant as evidence mounted against him. His fellow officers, fearing for their own careers, stopped returning his calls. His drinking increased, his marriage continued to deteriorate, and the realization that his actions might have criminal consequences began to sink in. "They're going to make an example of me," he complained bitterly to the few colleagues still willing to listen. while the real criminals walk free because we can't do our jobs anymore. The department's leadership, recognizing the inevitable, began positioning for damage control. Chief Robert Anderson, who had initially defended Reynolds publicly, now spoke of a few bad apples and the department's commitment to improving community relations. This pivot infuriated Reynolds, who felt abandoned by the very system that had protected and encouraged his behavior for years. "They taught us to police this way," he told his increasingly distant wife. "Now they're throwing me to the wolves to save themselves." The turning point came when a whistleblower from within the department, later revealed to be Officer Chen, provided documentation of an unofficial but widely understood policy of aggressive policing in transitional areas, where the historically white community bordered more diverse neighborhoods. The document, a training presentation never intended for public view, included guidelines for identifying non-resident subjects that used thinly veiled racial criteria. The exposure of this document, combined with the statistical evidence and personal testimonies, created a damning picture that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. A grand jury was convened to consider criminal charges against Reynolds for civil rights violations, false reporting, and evidence tampering. Additionally, the investigation expanded to include several supervising officers who had systematically dismissed complaints against Reynolds and others. As public pressure mounted and the evidence became increasingly irrefutable, the mayor of Silvercrest Heights finally abandoned her attempts to defend the department. In a carefully worded statement, she announced the formation of a civilian oversight committee and a comprehensive review of policing policies. "Our community deserves law enforcement that protects and serves all residents equally," she stated, though notably without acknowledging the years of complaints that had been ignored under her administration. For Marcus, the professional victory was tempered by the continuing personal costs. Death threats against him had become serious enough to warrant additional security measures. His children's normal teenage lives had been disrupted by constant scrutiny and periodic harassment. His effectiveness as FBI director was questioned by some political figures who viewed his focus on this case as a distraction from other priorities. Yet public support continued to grow as the case came to symbolize larger issues of accountability and equal justice. Letters and emails poured in from across the country, many from people of color sharing similar experiences with law enforcement and expressing gratitude that someone with power was finally acknowledging their reality. A watershed moment arrived when a coalition of reform-minded police chiefs from major cities issued a joint statement supporting the investigation and condemning discriminatory policing practices. "What happened to Director Washington could have happened to any person of color," the statement read. "True public safety requires trust between law enforcement and all communities they serve. That trust is impossible without accountability." As the grand jury deliberations continued in secret, Reynolds made an unexpected move. Through his newly hired attorney, he requested a private meeting with Marcus Washington, a meeting that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of both men's lives and potentially transform an entire community's approach to policing and justice. The private meeting between Marcus Washington and Officer Patrick Reynolds was arranged with extraordinary security precautions and absolute confidentiality. No media was informed, no official record would be kept, and only 3 people knew the exact location: Marcus Reynolds and Marcus's security detail leader, who remained outside the door of the small conference room in a nondescript federal building miles from either man's usual territory. Reynolds arrived first, escorted through a service entrance to avoid any possibility of being spotted. He sat alone at the table for 17 minutes, his leg bouncing nervously before the door opened, and Marcus Washington entered. The FBI director wore a simple charcoal suit with no tie, his face still bearing the faint yellowish remnants of bruising from their encounter a month earlier. Reynolds stood awkwardly, uncertainty flashing across his face. Should he offer to shake hands with the man he had physically assaulted? Before he could decide, Marcus gestured for him to sit and took the chair opposite him. For several uncomfortable seconds, neither man spoke. The room was clinically neutral. Beige walls, generic furniture, a single window with blinds drawn. The power dynamic between them had reversed so completely from their first meeting that Reynolds seemed physically smaller, hunched slightly in his chair, while Marcus sat with the straight-backed posture of a man accustomed to authority. "Appreciate you agreeing to meet with me, Director Washington." Reynolds finally said, his voice lacking the confident edge it had carried in Silvercrest Park. "My attorney advised against it, but I needed to speak with you directly." Marcus nodded, once his expression carefully neutral. "I'm listening, Officer Reynolds." Reynolds had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times in his mind, but now faced with the actual moment his prepared words evaporated. "I've lost everything," he blurted instead. "My job, my marriage is failing, my son won't even look at me. They're talking about criminal charges. My life is destroyed." Marcus watched him impassively. "Are you asking for my sympathy, Officer Reynolds?" The question wasn't delivered with cruelty, but with genuine curiosity. Reynolds flushed. "No, I don't expect that. I just wanted you to know that I'm already being punished more than any court could punish me." "And the other people you've treated the way you treated me?" Marcus asked quietly. "The ones without cameras recording, without the authority to demand accountability. What punishment did you face for those incidents?" Reynolds looked down at his hands, unable to hold Marcus's steady gaze. "I was just doing my job the way I was trained to do it." He muttered defensively, "The way everyone in the department does it. You identify potential threats, you neutralize them before they become problems. That's what keeps communities safe. Well, when black men jogging in parks are automatically potential threats, the question hung in the air between them. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "It's not that simple. You have to understand the culture. From day one in the academy, they pair you with field training officers who teach you who to watch, who to stop. They call it proactive policing officially, but unofficially." He trailed off, then continued more quietly. "Unofficially, you learn which neighborhoods to patrol more heavily, which types of people to question. You get praised when you make stops that lead to arrests, criticized if you're not productive enough." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "And if those stops and arrests disproportionately target people of color?" Reynolds met his eyes briefly before looking away again. "Nobody ever says it directly. It's all coded language, urban elements, individuals who don't belong in the area, maintaining neighborhood character. But everyone understands what it means. And if you question it, you get labeled soft or naive. You don't get backup as quickly when you call for it. You get assigned worse shifts, dangerous areas." For the first time, Marcus's expression showed something other than careful neutrality, a flicker of understanding. "So you went along with it?" Reynolds nodded slowly. "At first it was just following orders, doing what was expected. Then it becomes habit. Then it becomes who you are." He paused, struggling visibly with his next words. "I didn't start out wanting to be this person. I became a cop because my father was a cop, and his father before him. I wanted to help people to make a difference. And somewhere along the way you stopped seeing certain people as worth helping or protecting," Marcus observed. Reynolds didn't deny it. "Did you know I've had similar experiences to what happened in that park throughout my career?" Marcus continued. "Harvard Law federal prosecutor's credentials, FBI identification. None of it has shielded me from being profiled, questioned, followed in stores. My son has been stopped by police 3 times just walking home from school in our previous neighborhood. My daughter has been told by classmates that she got into her advanced program because of quotas, not because she earned it." Reynolds listened uncomfortably as Marcus continued. "What happened in that park wasn't unusual for me or for millions of black Americans. What was unusual was that I had the position and resources to demand accountability afterward. Most people don't." Reynolds rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking exhausted. "What do you want from me, Director Washington? Why did you agree to this meeting?" Marcus studied him for a long moment before answering. "I want to understand if you're capable of recognizing the real problem here. Not just your actions that day, but the system that encouraged and protected those actions. I want to know if you're willing to be part of changing that system instead of just another victim of it." Before Reynolds could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed with an urgent message. He glanced at the screen, his expression changing subtly as he read it. "Captain Wilson has just made a public statement," he informed Reynolds. "He's admitted to systematic cover-ups of misconduct complaints within the department, including all 6 filed against you personally." Reynolds paled visibly. "Wilson threw us under the bus. After all these years, or perhaps he finally chose integrity over complicity," Marcus countered. "He's provided documentation showing how complaints were routinely buried, particularly when filed by people of color. He's named names, including several superior officers who directed these cover-ups." The implications sank in slowly as Reynolds processed this information. His already precarious position had just become significantly worse. His former colleagues, already distancing themselves, would now view him as toxic. Criminal charges, which had been a possibility, now seemed inevitable. "I'm finished," he whispered more to himself than to Marcus. Marcus didn't disagree. Instead, he presented an alternative. "You have a choice to make, Officer Reynolds. You can continue to be a victim of this system, or you can help dismantle it. The grand jury is considering charges against you and several others. Your testimony about departmental practices, the unofficial policies, the training that encouraged profiling, the systematic dismissal of complaints, could be valuable." Reynolds looked up sharply. "You want me to testify against my fellow officers?" "My supervisors, they'd call me a rat. I'd never work in law enforcement again." "You're probably not going to work in law enforcement again regardless," Marcus pointed out bluntly. "But you could help ensure that what happened between us doesn't keep happening to others. You could be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Reynolds fell silent, the weight of the decision before him visible in his expression. Decades of police culture had ingrained in him that loyalty to fellow officers superseded all other considerations, even truth, even justice. Yet he couldn't deny that the system he had been loyal to had abandoned him at the first sign of trouble. "What would this mean, practically speaking?" he finally asked. "Reduced charges? Some kind of deal?" Marcus shook his head. "That's not for me to decide. The prosecutors will determine what, if any, arrangement might be appropriate based on the value of your cooperation. I'm not here to negotiate criminal matters." "Then why are you here?" Reynolds asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Why meet with me at all?" Marcus's response was measured but sincere. "Because I believe in the possibility of change, personal change, institutional change. Because despite everything, I want to believe that people can recognize their mistakes and work to correct them. Because this isn't just about punishing you, it's about fixing a broken system." For the first time since their encounter in the park, Reynolds looked directly into Marcus's eyes without flinching away. "I never thought I was a racist," he said quietly. "I always told myself I was just doing my job, following patterns, being a good cop. But when I saw you there, jogging in that park, before I even spoke to you, I'd already decided you didn't belong there. And I can't blame that on training or culture or anything else. That was me." The admission hung in the air between them, perhaps the first truly honest thing Reynolds had said since their initial encounter. "Recognizing that is the beginning," Marcus acknowledged, "but only the beginning." Their conversation was interrupted by another message on Marcus's phone, urgent enough that he excused himself to take a call in the hallway. When he returned minutes later, his expression was grave. "There's been a development," he informed Reynolds. "Captain Wilson has received death threats since his public statement. His car was vandalized this morning with the same message left at my home, 'Race Traitor.' Reynolds closed his eyes briefly. That would be Mahoney and his crew. They're the hardcore elements in the department. Wilson would know who they are. Marcus studied him carefully. Would you be willing to provide that information officially? It was the moment of decision. Reynolds sat silently for nearly a full minute, visibly wrestling with conflicting loyalties, before finally nodding. Yes, he said, his voice stronger than it had been at any point in their conversation. I'll testify about everything, the profiling, the cover-ups, the targeting of certain neighborhoods, all of it. As they concluded their meeting, neither man offered to shake hands. The distance between them still too great, the history too raw. But something had shifted, a first small step toward the accountability that real justice required. Reynolds would later describe this moment as when he finally chose to be the cop I once wanted to be, not the one I'd become. For Marcus, it represented the possibility that meaningful change could emerge from even the most painful confrontations, but only when truth was fully acknowledged. As he left the building through a separate exit, Marcus received another update from his office. Additional officers from Silvercrest Heights PD had come forward inspired by Captain Wilson's example, ready to testify about the department's discriminatory practices. The wall of silence was beginning to crumble, and with it the possibility of genuine transformation had emerged. 6 months after the confrontation in Silvercrest Park, Marcus Washington stood at the podium in the community center that overlooked the very same green space where he had once been handcuffed and humiliated. The audience before him represented a cross-section of the community: longtime residents, police officers, and uniform activists, local politicians, and ordinary citizens who had followed the remarkable transformation of their town over the preceding months. When I was appointed FBI director, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. I spoke about equal justice under law, not as an abstract ideal, but as a daily practice that must be evident in every interaction between law enforcement and the communities they serve. I never expected that my own experience would become a catalyst for the changes we're celebrating today. The changes he referenced had been both swift and profound. The Department of Justice investigation into Silvercrest Heights Police Department had confirmed widespread racial disparities in enforcement practices. Rather than fight the findings, the city had entered into a consent decree, a legally binding agreement to implement specific reforms under federal oversight. The most visible aspects of this transformation surrounded Patrick Reynolds, whose decision to cooperate with investigators had proved pivotal. After pleading guilty to reduced charges of civil rights violations, Reynolds had been sentenced to probation and community service rather than prison time. Part of his sentence included working with the newly established Civilian Oversight Committee, where his first-hand knowledge of problematic practices helped identify necessary changes. Officer Reynolds could have remained part of the problem, Marcus acknowledged, nodding to where Reynolds sat in the audience. Instead, he chose to be part of the solution. His testimony helped expose practices that had remained hidden for decades, and his willingness to speak honestly about his own mistakes has become a powerful example for others. Reynolds, noticeably thinner and grayer than he had been 6 months earlier, nodded slightly in acknowledgement. His life had been irrevocably altered. His police career over his marriage ended his relationship with his son, still strained. Yet there was a different quality to him now, a humility and purpose that had replaced his former arrogance. He worked daily with the Oversight Committee, using his insider knowledge to help draft new policies and training protocols. Perhaps most significantly, he had begun speaking to police cadets about his experience, offering himself as a cautionary tale about how good intentions could be corrupted by unchecked bias and a culture of impunity. The changes extended far beyond one officer's journey, however. Captain Wilson, who had risked his career and safety to expose departmental wrongdoing, had postponed his retirement to help implement the reforms. After initial resistance and resentment from some colleagues, his moral courage had gradually earned him renewed respect within the department. Now he worked alongside Marcus on a national training program for police leadership focusing on creating cultures of accountability and ethical policing. Officer Sarah Chen, whose early recognition of Marcus at the park had been the first step toward de-escalating the situation, had been promoted to sergeant and now headed the department's newly created Community Relations Division. Her willingness to speak truth to power, even at personal risk, had marked her as a natural leader in the reform department. Real change requires more than new policies or training programs, Marcus continued in his address. It requires a fundamental shift in how we think about policing community and justice. It requires courage from all sides, the courage to acknowledge problems, the courage to listen to uncomfortable truths, and the courage to change deeply ingrained patterns. The audience included Alicia Rodriguez, whose phone recording of the initial incident had gone viral and sparked national attention. Now 19, she had founded a youth advocacy group that worked directly with the police department on community engagement programs. Tyler Johnson, the teenager who had recognized Marcus that day but had been too afraid to speak up, now served on a youth advisory council that provided input on policing policies affecting young people. Even Marcus's family had found healing and purpose through the ordeal. James had channeled his initial anger into productive activism, creating a school program that brought students and police officers together for honest dialogues about race and authority. Zoe had discovered her voice as a writer, publishing a powerful essay about her family's experience that had been reprinted in national media. Vanessa had helped establish a support network for families affected by racial profiling incidents. The Washington family had remained in Silvercrest Heights despite the difficult beginning, gradually finding acceptance in a community that was itself undergoing profound self-examination. 6 months ago, I jogged through this park and encountered a system that treated me as inherently suspicious because of the color of my skin, Marcus noted. Today, I can jog the same path and experience what every citizen deserves: the freedom to exist in public space without fear or harassment. This transformation didn't happen by chance or time. It happened because people of goodwill from all parts of this community chose to confront uncomfortable truths and do the hard work of creating change. As if to illustrate his point, the ceremony concluded with a symbolic gesture: Marcus and Patrick Reynolds walking together through the park where they had first encountered each other, followed by a diverse group of officers and citizens. The image, captured by news cameras and shared widely on social media, represented something few had thought possible. 6 months earlier, the victim and perpetrator of a racially charged incident walking side by side toward reconciliation and reform. Near the end of the walk, they passed a scene that perfectly encapsulated the change that had occurred. A young black jogger was stopped by a Silvercrest Heights police officer, not for questioning, but because he had dropped his keys further back on the path. The officer, following the department's new community engagement protocols, had picked them up and jogged to return them. The simple interaction, respectful and human, represented the possibility of a new relationship between police and the communities they served. Marcus watched from a distance, recognizing that the transformation was still fragile, still incomplete. Changing policies was relatively straightforward. Changing hearts and minds was a longer, more complex process. Some officers had resigned rather than adapt to new expectations. Some community members remained skeptical that the changes would last. The consent decree would eventually expire, and the federal oversight would end. The true test would come in the years ahead, when the spotlight had moved on, and the daily choice to maintain these new patterns would rest with individual officers and department leaders. Yet as he looked around at the community that had come together, not in perfect harmony but in genuine commitment to doing better, Marcus felt something he had not expected to feel when he first lay bleeding on the pavement of Silvercrest Park hope. Not naive hope that ignored the deep challenges still to be overcome, but realistic hope grounded in the concrete changes he had witnessed over 6 remarkable months. The work continues, he told the assembled group as they completed their walk. "Equal justice isn't a destination we reach once and for all. It's a path we must choose every day in every interaction." But what we've accomplished here proves that meaningful change is possible when we have the courage to demand it and work for it together. As the gathering dispersed, a reporter asked Marcus if he regretted moving to Silvercrest Heights, given all that had occurred. His response captured both the personal cost and the broader significance of what had transpired. Sometimes the place where you experience injustice becomes the place where you help create justice. I believe that's what's happening here, not just for me or my family, but for everyone who calls this community home. That evening, as Marcus walked home with his family, he reflected on how a moment of humiliation had transformed into a catalyst for meaningful change. The path forward would not be easy or straightforward, but the first difficult steps had been taken. What more powerful message could he give his children than showing them that systems of injustice, however entrenched, could be changed when enough people committed themselves to the work of transformation? What do you think about Marcus's choice to stay in Silvercrest Heights and work for change, rather than seeking revenge against those who wronged him? Comment below with your thoughts on how communities can heal after incidents like this. If you found this story powerful, please like and subscribe to support more content that explores important social issues. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how systemic racism affects real people, and how we can all be part of creating more just communities. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Remember that the work of justice continues every day, and each of us has a role to play. This story illustrates how systemic racism persists even against those in positions of power. Marcus Washington's experience demonstrates that racial bias transcends education achievement and status. The transformation from incident to meaningful change shows that accountability is possible when people refuse to accept injustice as normal. Officer Reynolds' journey reveals how prejudice can become institutionalized, normalized, and protected by systems designed to resist scrutiny. His eventual cooperation demonstrates that personal redemption begins with acknowledging uncomfortable truths about oneself. The Washington family's decision to stay and fight rather than retreat teaches us that confronting injustice often requires personal sacrifice. The community's evolution shows that healing is possible when citizens engage honestly with painful realities rather than denying them. Captain Wilson and Officer Chen exemplify how courage from within broken systems is essential for meaningful reform. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that change happens through persistent, systematic effort rather than symbolic gestures. True justice requires transforming policies, practices, and perspectives over time. It demands courage from victims, to speak truth, humility from perpetrators, to acknowledge wrongdoing, and commitment from communities to uphold new standards even when attention fades. What would you do if you witnessed racial discrimination happening in your community? Would you have the courage to speak up, like Officer Chen, or would fear keep you silent? Have you ever experienced or witnessed racial profiling firsthand? Your stories matter in this ongoing conversation about justice and equality. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help it reach more viewers. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that shine light on important social issues too often kept in shadows. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how racial bias affects real people every day, even those in positions of authority. Have you seen positive changes in policing in your own community? What specific reforms do you think would make the biggest difference? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for engaging with this difficult but necessary story. Together we can build communities where justice truly applies equally to everyone, regardless of skin color or social position. Remember, meaningful change begins with awareness, but requires sustained action from all of us.